Since the time of my earliest memories, I was drawn to Native Americans. Even as a young child, I would sit for hours looking at these books with pictures of Native Americans and their ritual practices. And by the time I was 14, when I began to hear about the traditional Native doctors, the medicine men and women, the kinds of visionary experiences they had going through the vision quest, the healing gifts they possess, the paranormal abilities, and I was thinking to myself in those moments, if ever given the opportunity, this is what I'm going to do with my life. By the time I was 17, I'd already taken off on my own, shortly after completing my junior year of high school. I landed in a community of Kiowa Indians in southwestern Oklahoma. And right off, I started to go into the peyote meetings with the Native elders. One of my peers, a young friend of mine, Steve, and I was talking to him when I was over at his house and telling him how much I wanted to go into the peyote meetings. And so he says to his father, he says, "Hey, Dad, Ben wants to go into the peyote meetings." This elderly man, Jack, who was raising him. And for some reason, he made an exception for me, because normally the Kiowa didn't allow non-Native people to go into the peyote meetings. And he later received some pushback from some of the other Native elders, and yet Jack said to them, "This one is different. Let him come in." It wasn't too long afterwards that in one of these meetings that I met the man who was to become my mentor, Horace Daukei, one of the last surviving traditional doctors among the Kiowa tribe. I think it was about a year later when this elderly man, Jack, one of his grandsons, was suffering from some kind of rare blood disorder, and he had arranged for Horace to conduct what they refer to as a doctoring meeting, where Horace was to treat his grandson. And I was so afraid that Horace wouldn't allow me into the meetings because, as I said, many of the Native people didn't allow non-Natives to come into the meetings. But I was talking with my friend Steve at one point, and Horace was in a room across the hall, and he stopped and stared at me with this intense look. I mean, it felt as though he was peering right through me, and it sent chills through my body. In hindsight, I think he realized in that moment that I would later become his apprentice. After some time, we lined up outside the teepee, circled around clockwise, entered the teepee, and then we took our seats. And during that meeting, the drum made about 2 rounds. And then shortly after midnight, Horace began to work on his patient. Initially, he covered his patient with a black silk handkerchief, and Horace, like these indigenous doctors over the centuries, possessed paranormal abilities. He took a live piece of charcoal out of the fire and put it into his mouth. And he's blowing on that charcoal, and the sparks are flying from his mouth as he does so. And then at a certain point, he reached his hands towards the ground. He had this live mole come up out of the ground into his hands, and he set it on the patient. The young man he was working on, and it was facilitating its aspect of the healing. For many people who haven't really had any interaction or lived among Native people or indigenous peoples as I have, it might be hard to grasp what I'm saying. And yet what we're familiar with living in our modern day world is only a very narrow range of human potential, what people are capable of, in other words. And if you were to go into the university libraries, as I did in my teens, where I spent a great deal of time and I just read innumerable books, and I would hear all these accounts from people who had lived among the various tribes, books that were written, anywhere from the 1860s, maybe up to the 1940s or so. And they would describe or relate accounts from Native elders about individuals, traditional doctors, and the profound gifts of healing they possessed, others who had the ability to in times of drought, who could call the rain, or if a tornado was headed towards the village, they could redirect the tornado and it would go off in another direction. There was something referred to as war medicine. So you had these individuals who would go flying into the midst of the battle and people would shoot at them, and there were accounts of sometimes where the feathers would be shot out of their war bonnet, and yet these individuals had not a scratch on their bodies. And so it was, these kinds of gifts and capabilities were fairly common among Native people. About a year after watching Horace doctor his patient for that first time, and I was back in college, my grades were starting to go down. I think at some level I realized I wasn't doing what I really needed to be doing with my life. And so after speaking with a few friends, I decided I would approach Horace. I had gone by his cousin's house where people had told me he was staying when he would come into town. And the cousin would blow me off, and I guess he was telling Horace at some point that, hey, this white kid keeps coming by and asking for you. And Horace said, well, he comes by again. I want to see him. I want to talk to him. So this next time I went by, and Horace came out and he sat in the car with me, and I was physically shaking at the time. I was so terrified that he would say, well, these healing gifts, this medicine that I possess, these kinds of powers, they only work for people who are born native. So as the words were coming out of my mouth, as I said, I was trembling, and I said as best I could, very awkwardly, I want to learn to do what you're doing. And he looks back and he says, what are you doing this weekend? Can you start fasting? And still shaking, I say, yeah, sure. And so he has me drive down into the Wichita Mountains, not eating or drinking for the next 2 days and nights, sitting in my car, parked down there in the Wichita Mountains. And that was his way of determining, is this guy really serious? So after about 2 days and nights, I met him after a peyote meeting that he had conducted, as he had instructed me to. After speaking for a while, he said, well, when you finish your semester, and I was into my second year of college, he says, well, come on out to New Mexico, to where I'm staying on the Navajo Indian Reservation, where I'm living with my wife, and we'll get started. And so a few months later, after completing the semester, I took off with a handful of friends, and we were in this caravan from Oklahoma. The other friends went on to California. I met up with the brother of one friend, and we headed on up to Taos and then across to the Navajo Reservation. We had no idea how to find Horace, but we just headed in that direction. But that night, we arrived in Shiprock, and we see a teepee up. And so we assume, well, there's a peyote meeting, and we'll go spend the night in the meeting. And fortunately, some of the people in the meeting, they knew where Horace lived, and they told us, and so we made our way to his home the next day. Everything about the apprenticeship was intense. From the start, Horace had me go along with him as he was working with his patients. And then in the apprenticeship itself, as I apprenticed with him, Horace would, at times, as the traditional doctors tended to transmit their healing gifts to a younger apprentice, there were times where he would take objects such as the end of a feather, and he would seed portions of his medicine, that those healing gifts or powers that he possessed, and he would transmit that to me. Whenever he would do that, it would sound like a gun with a silencer going off, and I would feel this intense force impacting me. He always had someone standing behind me, holding me from the back, because whenever that happened, it would knock me unconscious briefly. And as I'd come to, I would feel this powerful force operating within, but I would just rest and assimilate what was happening. And then, in order to earn the right to work with these gifts of healing, Horace would have me go on the vision quest, which is a traditional native practice that involves fasting for 4 days and nights without food and water. As I progressed, Horace began to have me take a more active role and assisting him as he worked with his patients. I remember one occasion where he had me working with a man who was left paralyzed from the waist down after a front end loader turned over, and this man was pinned underneath. And Horace had me doing this technique or practice that involves using suction and actually pulling blood clots from the back of this man's leg. And I was in total shock seeing that happen, that the blood clots actually came out of this man's leg. And it's like, part of me is like, shit, it actually worked. And yet I was still very hesitant to work on my own, fearing that I didn't quite know what I was doing. I didn't have enough experience or knowledge. And yet Horace said to me at one point, he says, you have the medicine. You have to start working with people on your own. I cannot tell you everything you need to do because this power is going to work differently for you than it does for me. One of Horace's own family members that I've stayed in touch with over the years was telling me about how Horace received the medicine from his own father. And it wasn't too long afterwards that Horace had enlisted in the army. I don't know if he was drafted. I don't have all the details, but before long, he had shipped off to Europe and he was fighting in World War II. Even at the time I knew him, he still had flecks of German shrapnel on his back from when he was in combat. And sometime later, one of Horace's young sons was pretty seriously ill. And somebody that Horace knew at the time said to him, you have your father's medicine, use it to help your son. Horace's son recovered. Now, Horace was mind-blowingly powerful, and there were many instances in which people were seriously ill, and even some in which people were not expected to live, and yet they recovered as a result of his intervention. And he was profoundly gifted when it came to treating health-related issues. And he also had the ability to look into people's bodies and see in great detail exactly what was going on. And even though he didn't know proper anatomical terms, I think maybe he had an 8th grade education, if even that, because a lot of the native people didn't stay in school very long in those days. He would describe in great intricate detail what was happening in people's bodies. And even though Horace was profoundly gifted as a healer, he struggled to work effectively with his own emotions. He didn't really know how, in other words, because that understanding just wasn't really available in his time. And there were ways in which he could be pretty reckless. And towards the end of my apprenticeship, he became rather destructive, and much of the power that he possessed began to leave. Although this family member that I mentioned earlier was telling me that it later returned to him. Seeing Horace's destructive side and not knowing what else to do, I severed contact, which was very painful to me for a number of reasons, because Horace was in many ways the closest thing I'd ever known to a father. And it also felt as though my dream of finding a powerful native doctor to learn from, to apprentice with, that everything was all crashing down around me. And it wasn't until a few years later when I seriously began to work with people individually on my own, and I started getting their feedback, and I was thinking, oh, I guess I really did receive something incredibly powerful from Horace. Horace inadvertently taught me a profound lesson he never intended to teach, that even though one might possess extraordinary power, you're still human, you're still flawed. The stakes are just much higher. In sharing this, my intention is not to disparage Horace, though I've been accused of that. Horace set me on the path, and I still miss him to this day. Yet I feel strongly we need to, all of us, self-examine and to honestly assess and address our own dysfunction. I genuinely feel that Horace was doing the best he could at the time with the understanding he possessed. The problem for Horace and adepts of many of the ancient spiritual traditions is that their understanding of trauma and how to work effectively with their emotions is extremely limited. Of all the spiritual lineages I'm familiar with, none of them are trauma literate. They don't possess the understanding needed to work effectively with their emotions, and that is clearly evident when you take a look at many of these cultures. For instance, the brutal warfare that was prevalent among Native Americans, and it was common for tribes to massacre one another. Horrific abuses of casteism have been commonplace in India for centuries. And although its influence is waning, it is still widely practiced today. I was also shocked by the level of physical abuse of children that I witnessed when I was spending time in China. I've spent many years traveling to different parts of the world and spending time with people of many different spiritual traditions, including some who had attained varying degrees of mastery and possessed extraordinary powers. In some cases, they didn't know any better. In others, they were attempting a spiritual bypass, believing their spiritual attainment made them exempt from doing the hard work of feeling and digesting their own emotions. Yet some of these individuals had suffered a great deal of trauma along the way. We all carry emotional wounds and struggle in some way, and many of us have suffered various traumas at some point in our lives. People often contract around the traumas they've experienced and the deeply wounded parts of themselves. Others are more inclined to act out these traumas by wounding other individuals. Either way, we're hurting ourselves and others. When someone possesses such extraordinary powers such as Horace or the adepts of other ancient spiritual traditions, the power that works through them can greatly amplify the wounded parts of themselves, all the dysfunction they're carrying, and because they possess all this power, they're more likely to work with and have influence over large numbers of people. What happens is they often act out their trauma and other aspects of their woundedness, our dysfunction among their own followers. There are so many examples of this. Indian gurus, prominent Buddhist and Sufi teachers, the cult-like followings, sexual abuse of devotees, heavy drug use, and in a few extreme cases, even murder. Spending lots of time in India and Sri Lanka, I would hear examples of this all the time. One woman that I worked with for a while, she was telling me, I think she spent time at, I believe it was Naropa Institute and Chogyam Trungpa, and he drank rather heavily, and she told me about one instance where he was behind the podium and he was swaying back and forth, and he was saying, "We're hopeless and helpless, helpless and hopeless." And some of the other Buddhist lamas or teachers were saying, "Hey guy, you have something really good going on here, but you gotta lay off the booze, you gotta sober up here." But another consideration here is one of the reasons so many people are susceptible to all this turbocharged spiritual dysfunction is that those who follow have their own blind spots, because many of them, probably the majority, are not doing their own deep level processing needed to heal their own emotional wounds. Over the years, I've worked with many current and former devotees of gurus and other spiritual teachers who have shared at times the graphic and sordid details of what their gurus and teachers have perpetrated. The sessions I offer help to facilitate the healing of the deep emotional wounds they carry. For as long as I can remember, I've watched people and learned from their examples. And there's always a part of me that's fearful of making these same stupid mistakes. There's a carefulness on my part, so that's why I pay attention to. Again, I'd rather learn from the examples of others rather than make those painful mistakes myself. Horace taught me a profound lesson he never intended to teach, that one has to deal with their trauma and emotional wounding, and only by doing so does one develop the healthy foundation needed to truly do the work and serve others. As I began to work with the gifts of healing that Horace passed on to me to assist others, initially it was like pouring hydrogen peroxide into a deeply infected wound. The traumas of my own childhood and adolescence began to reemerge, and I found myself reenacting them in my attempts to form intimate relationships. And at first, I was at a complete loss, overwhelmed by all the painful, at times excruciating emotions I was feeling. I sought out a psychotherapist, and that was very helpful to the extent that it helped me to gain an intellectual understanding of the trauma I'd suffered and my emotional wounding, yet it wasn't actually healing those deeply wounded parts of me. During this time, when my relationships weren't working that well, I was struggling with the pattern of unrequited love, forming attachments to women who were disinterested or unavailable, and a few who were quite abusive. The pain I felt was so debilitating, yet instinctively I sensed that I needed to dive into the depths of all those painful emotions, sometimes for hours on end, yet at a certain point I could feel the pain breaking open and coming out of my body in waves. And then underneath that, I would feel this powerful warmth emerging, along with this sense of connectedness to a higher power. Working with this practice continues to be an important part of my healing process, and I teach it to everyone I work with. Being human, there are times when I get triggered emotionally, yet overall the pain has lightened, and I work through things so much faster. Yet I continue this practice daily. I acknowledge what's happening and what I feel in response, and where the feelings are situated in my body, and I fully immerse my awareness in the depths of these feelings and sensations, and I'll breathe softly and deeply, following the feelings and sensations as they go through their progression. Much of humanity wants to disconnect from that which feels unpleasant and from the wounded parts of themselves. Many people escape through work, digital media, recreational drugs, and other distractions, and spiritual and religious folks often attempt to do a spiritual bypass. By doing so, we're only compounding the issues. Our lived experiences and emotional responses need to be thoroughly digested, which can only happen by working with the process I described above. By learning to work effectively with your emotions and doing the work required to heal the deeply wounded parts of you, you develop the healthy, grounded foundation and humility to work with the knowledge and any capabilities you develop, including spiritual gifts, in a way that makes this world a better place and facilitates true healing. Having trained with a traditional native doctor and gone through so many vision quests, and after years of doing the hard work to heal my own deep emotional wounds, I now work as a conduit, as Indigenous healers have done for centuries, to facilitate the healing of the body and mind. If this resonates with you and you want to explore further, you're welcome to reach out. We can talk about what you're going through and the practices that help, whether it makes sense for you to work with me. To learn more or schedule a session, call or message 332-333-5155 or visit teachmetomeditate.com or benoofana.com.